The office was empty now. Ambassador Kale Vasquez stood in the doorway and looked at the room one last time. The shelves were bare, the drawers were clean, the pictures of Earth that had once hung on the walls were packed away in a box that was already on its way to a ship. All that remained was a single data pad sitting in the center of the desk. On it was one word enough: Kyle. Did not look back as he walked out. His shoes made soft sounds on the polished stone floor of the hallway. Other offices along the corridor were also empty. The lights inside them had already been turned off. The human section of the Galactic Council station was going dark, one room at a time, like stars winking out at the edge of the sky. No one stopped him. No one noticed. That was the funny thing about humans on Nexus Primus. 200 years they had been here, and still most species walked past them without a second glance. That was about to change. Cal reached the docking bay where a shuttle was waiting. A young officer named Priya stood by the door. She had red eyes from crying, but her back was straight and her voice was steady. All personnel are aboard, sir. Every embassy across Council space has confirmed shutdown. We are the last ones. Kyle nodded. He stepped into the shuttle without a word. The doors closed behind him and the ship pulled away from Nexus Primus in silence. No farewell broadcast, no angry transmission, just the quiet hum of engines and the growing distance between one species and every other. It had not always been this way. 200 years ago, when humanity first reached the stars and made contact with the wider galaxy, that there had been hope, so much hope. The Galactic Council was an ancient body, a gathering of over 400 species that governed trade, law, and peace across 1,000 sectors. To join it was to become part of something vast and important. Humanity had been thrilled. They were given the rank of Class 7 provisional species, the lowest tier. The Council explained that this was normal for newcomers. Every young species started at the bottom. They would need to prove themselves before they could rise, and so humans set out to prove themselves. They shared their medical knowledge freely. Human doctors had a gift for adapting treatments across biological barriers. Within decades, human-designed drugs were saving lives on hundreds of worlds. Species that had suffered from incurable diseases for centuries suddenly found relief, all because a group of short-lived primates from a small blue planet had figured out how to make medicine that worked for everyone. They shared their engineering. Human architects redesigned the FTL relay network that connected the galaxy, making it faster and more stable. They did this as a gift, asking for nothing in return except goodwill. They built bridges between stars and never charged a toll. They volunteered their soldiers. When border conflicts flared, human officers stepped in to lead joint peacekeeping missions. They were good at it, remarkably good. They had a talent for holding groups together, for finding common ground between species that hated each other, for standing in the middle of a fight and refusing to move until everyone calmed down. And through all of this, they asked for only one thing: a seat at the table, a real seat with voting rights and a permanent place on the council, not because they wanted power, but because they wanted to be seen, to be recognized as equals. The answer every single time was no. The Viori hegemony led the opposition. They were an ancient species, tall and elegant, with silver skin and lifespans that stretched over 1,000 years. their representative on the council. Counselor Atharis spoke about humans, the way one might speak about a clever pet. She acknowledged their usefulness, but questioned their stability. Their lives are so short, she said during one debate, her voice smooth and unhurried. They burn through a generation in the time it takes us to finish a single thought. How can we trust the judgment of a species that barely has time to learn from its mistakes before it dies? The Dreth Concordance was worse. The Dreth were a militaristic reptilian species who saw the galaxy as a hierarchy of strength. To them, humans were weak, soft-bodied, emotional, sentimental creatures who wasted resources on things like art and music. In parks, the Dreth delegate, a hulking figure named Gorath, made no effort to hide his contempt. Let them serve, he said once, his deep voice rumbling through the chamber. Service is what lesser species are for, and so the pattern continued, decade after decade. Humans gave and the galaxy took. Humans asked and the galaxy said no. The vote for human elevation came up 11 times. Over the course of a century, it failed. Every single time, not because humanity lacked support from everyone, but because the major powers, the Valorian, the Dreth and their many client species, always had enough votes to block it. Breaking point came with Ars Reach. Ars Reach was a human colony world on the outer edge of Council space. It was a beautiful planet, green and blue, with wide oceans and gentle mountains. 3 million people lived there, families, children, farmers and teachers and engineers who had built something good. In the quiet corner of the galaxy, the Scythe raiders hid it without warning. The Scythe were a predatory species from beyond the border, not part of the Council but tolerated by it because they mostly attacked on important targets. When their fleet dropped out of hyperspace above Allah's reach, the colony sent out a distress call to the Council, and the humans did everything right. They filed a formal petition for a joint defense resolution. They followed every rule, every procedure, every protocol. Ambassador Vasquez stood before the full council and spoke with calm urgency. 3 million of our people are under attack right now, he said. We are asking for help, not as a favor, not as charity, as members of this community who have bled for every species in this room. The Valerie abstained from the vote. The Dreth voted against it. The smaller species, terrified of angering either power, followed their lead. Resolution failed. Humanity fought alone. Their fleet raced to Ars Reach and engaged the Scythian in a brutal battle that lasted 9 days. They won. They drove the raiders back, but the cost was enormous. 40,000 civilians dead, an entire fleet group destroyed, cities burned to ash on a world that had once been a paradise. The Council sent a message of condolence, 3 sentences long. It was read aloud in the chamber by a junior clerk because none of the senior counselors could be bothered to deliver it personally. Kel Vasquez listened to those 3 sentences from his seat at the back of the room in the cheap section where provisional species were placed. He did not react. He did not stand up. He did not shout or cry or slam his fist on the table. He simply closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, something had changed behind them. Something had gone quiet. In the weeks that followed, things happened so smoothly that no one noticed until it was too late. Human trade ships stopped arriving at their usual ports. 1 human medical teams were quietly recalled from the worlds they served. Human engineers packed up their tools and left the relay stations they had been maintaining for free. Human soldiers resigned from joint peacekeeping forces with polite letters and handshakes. Every human embassy on every world, on every station went dark. On the same day, the lights turned off, the doors locked, the communication channels closed simultaneously across the entire galaxy, as if someone had thrown a single switch. No declaration of war, no angry ultimatum, no dramatic speech broadcast across all channel, just absent, just silence, just the sudden total disappearance of an entire species from every place they had ever been. The council was confused, then annoyed, then briefly concerned. An emergency session was called. The delegates murmured and argued and pointed fingers. Surely this was some kind of political stunt. The humans were throwing a tantrum. They would be back in a week, embarrassed and apologetic. Councillor Aetheras of the Valor stood before the assembly and addressed the matter with the calm authority that had defined her long career. Her silver face showed nothing but mild amusement. "Let them go," she said, waving one long-fingered hand as if brushing away a fly. "They will return soon enough. They always do. They need us far more than we need them." She paused and smiled, thin and certain. After all, where else would they go? The chamber murmured in agreement. The matter was set aside. Council moved on to more important business. Outside the windows of Nexus Primus, in the vast darkness between the stars, when 1,000 human ships moved in perfect formation toward the edge of the galaxy, they carried families and libraries and seeds and machines and everything a civilization needed to start again. They moved without haste and without fear. They had been preparing for this for a very long time, and they did not look back. 6 months after the humans left the first hospital ran out of medicine. It was on Vrath Prime, the home world of the Mareth, a small and peaceful species, known for their delicate blue skin and their talent for music. The Maradi had never been warriors or conquerors. They were artists and philosophers, and they had always been kind to humans. Their delegate on the council, Councillor Thenok, was one of the few who had voted in favor of human elevation every single time. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that a plague was spreading through the southern continent, and the cure, drug called Veridine 7, had been a human invention. It was manufactured in human laboratories using a process that human scientists had developed over 40 years of careful work. The formula had never been published, not because humans were secretive, but because the council had never asked for it. Why would they? The humans had always been there to make more. Now the humans were gone, and the Veridine 7 supply was running out. Councillor Thenok stood before the full assembly with tears running down his blue face. He was not a dramatic person. By nature, he was quiet and thoughtful, the kind of leader who listened more than he spoke. But on this day his voice filled the chamber. 12,000 of my people have died this month, he said. We're 12,000, and the number grows every day. We need Veridine 7, and only the humans know how to make it. I am begging this council to reach out to them. Send a message, send an envoy, send anything. The Dreth delegate Gorath leaned back in his massive chair and crossed his thick arms over his chest. His yellow eyes showed nothing but annoyance. Marais should have prepared for this. He said it is not the Council's fault that your species became dependent on human charity. Develop your own medicine. We have been trying, then said, his voice breaking. Our scientists have been working day and night, but Veridine 7 is beyond our understanding. The humans were generations ahead of us in adaptive pharmacology. We cannot replicate what we do not understand. Then perhaps you should have treated them better when they were here, said a voice from the back of the chamber. It belonged to a delegate from a minor insectoid species, and it was spoken so quietly that most of the room did not hear it, but then heard it, and the words cut deeper than any blade. Motion to contact humanity was voted down. The velour abstained again. Dreth voted against the pattern held. Even now, even with people dying, old habits were hard to break, especially when those habits were built on pride. But the medicine was only the beginning. 3 weeks after the speech, the first FTL relay node failed. It was node 7742, a junction point in the Keith sector that handled traffic between 60 inhabited systems. The node had been designed, built, and maintained by human engineers as part of the network upgrade they had gifted to the Council decades ago. It was brilliant technology, elegant and efficient, far beyond what any other species had produced. It was also completely beyond what any other species could repair. When node 7742 went offline, travel times in the Cather sector jumped from hours to weeks. Trade ships that had been carrying food and supplies to dozens of worlds were stranded or forced to take long detours. Markets crashed, supply chains broke. Thriving economic region began to choke. The Council dispatched its best engineers to fix the node. They spent 3 weeks studying the human design. They could not figure out how it worked. The technology was not hidden or encrypted, it was simply too advanced. And the human engineers who had built it understood principles of subspace field manipulation that the rest of the galaxy had not yet discovered. Trying to repair, it was like asking a child to fix a quantum computer. More nodes began to fail, one by one across the galaxy. The lights of the relay network flickered and dimmed. Travel became slower. Communication became unreliable. The galaxy, which had grown used to being connected, began to feel very large and very empty. And then came the Scythe. The Scythe Confederacy had been watching. They were predators, and predators knew how to spot weakness. With the humans gone, the galaxy's border defenses had collapsed. The joint peacekeeping forces, which had relied heavily on human officers for leadership and coordination, were in disarray. Different species argued about strategy. If fleets refused to follow orders from commanders of other species, the unity that humans had quietly held together with patience and skill fell apart the moment they stopped holding it. The Scythe hit 3 border colonies in a single week. They were fast, brutal, and efficient. The Council scrambled to respond, but the response was slow and confused. By the time a defense fleet arrived at the first colony, it had already fallen. The other 2 held out for a few days longer, but without coordinated support, they too were overwhelmed. In the Council chamber, the mood was shifting. The smug confidence that had followed humanity's departure was fading. In its place was something that most of the delegates had never felt before, at least not in connection with humans. It was a cold, creeping unease, the beginning of understanding. But not everyone was ready to understand. Counselor Aetheras of the Valori still held firm. She was a proud woman, and pride was the foundation of everything she had built in her long career. Admitting that the council had made a mistake about humans would mean admitting that she personally had been wrong, and Aetheras had not been wrong about anything in 400 years. So when the council commissioned a quiet intelligence operation to locate the humans, she made sure it was kept small and discreet. No grand gesture, no public admission of need, just a single agent sent to find out where the humans had gone so that the council could assess the situation privately. The agent she chose was Sarath. Sarath was Valori like Aetheras, but younger and less certain. She was an intelligence officer trained in observation and analysis, nay, with a reputation for seeing things that others missed. She had silver skin like all Valori, but her eyes were darker than most, a deep violet that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She had met humans before. During her training, she had been stationed on a border world where a small human peacekeeping team was helping to resolve a land dispute between two local species. She remembered them as strange, busy creatures, always moving, always talking, always doing something. They laughed too loudly and cared too much and never seemed to rest. She also remembered that they had resolved the dispute in 2 weeks. The council's own mediators had been trying for 6 years. Sarah took a fast scout ship and began her search at the last known coordinates of human space. What she found there chilled her. Every human world was empty, not destroyed, not abandoned in haste, but carefully and completely vacated. The buildings were still standing, the roads were still clean, the power grids were still running on automatic, but there was not a single human being anywhere. It was as if an entire civilization had simply stood up from the table and walked away, leaving everything neat and orderly behind them. On colony after colony, the story was the same. No panic, no chaos, no signs of conflict or disagreement, just a calm, organized departure of hundreds of billions of people moving in perfect coordination across dozens of star systems. Sarath began to feel something she had never felt before. It took her a while to identify it, because it was not an emotion that Valori were taught to recognize. It was awe. She followed the trail beyond the borders of council space, into the deep black between the galactic arms, toward a region of space that the council's star charts labeled as empty, uninhabitable. Nothing out clear's throat there but dust and dead stars. But her sensors told a different story. The farther she flew, the more energy signatures she detected, faint at first, then stronger. Radio signals, thermal emissions, the unmistakable fingerprints of a living civilization, not dying but thriving. Somewhere in the darkness ahead. She did not go closer. Her orders were to observe, not to make contact. She turned her ship around and flew back to Nexus Primus as fast as her engines could carry her. Her report to Counselor Either was delivered in person behind closed doors. Sarath stood at attention while the old counselor read the document on her data pad. She watched Aetheras' silver face carefully and saw something she had never seen there before. A flicker, a tiny crack in the mask. They planned this for years, Sarath said, possibly decades. The logistics of moving that many people, that much infrastructure to an uncharted region of space, it would have required Preparation on a scale that should have been impossible to hide, but they hid it. From us, from everyone, Ether set down. The data pad, her hand, Sarah noticed, was not entirely steady, and you say, they are growing. The energy output I detected is consistent with a civilization that is not just surviving, but expanding rapidly. Etheris was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was still controlled, still measured, but the certainty that had always been there was thinner now, like ice over deep water. Oh, this changes nothing, she said. They left by choice. They can live in the dark if they wish. Sareth wanted to argue, but did not. She was trained to obey, but as she walked out of Atheris's office, she thought about those empty human worlds, so clean and orderly, so carefully left behind. She thought about the plague on Vireth Prime and the failing relay nodes, and the Scythian burning through the border, and she thought about the energy readings from beyond the rim, all that light, all that life, all that power growing in the silence. They had not gone to the dark, they had gone to build their own light. Back in council space, the news continued to worsen. 2 more relay nodes failed in the same week. A food crisis hit the industrial world of Kassara when the human agricultural consultants who had been managing their crop rotations were no longer there to adjust the soil chemistry. The harvest failed. Millions went hungry. On the floor of the council chamber, Counselor then stood up again. This time he did not cry. His voice was flat and hard, the voice of a man who had run out of grief and found something colder underneath. The death toll on Vireth Prime has reached 90,000, he said. I will not ask this council for help again. I can see that this body has no help left to give. I only want to say one thing for the record. He looked around the chamber at the hundreds of delegates who would not meet his eyes. We deserve this, he said. Then he sat down, and in the chamber was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the station's life support systems working away in the walls, keeping everyone alive, everyone who was still there. 2 years after the humans left, the galaxy was falling apart. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a building collapses when someone removes the support beams one by one. First a crack in the ceiling, then a groan in the walls, then a slow, terrible lean to one side, and by the time anyone thought to run, the whole structure was coming down. The translation network was the next thing to break. Most species in the galaxy did not speak the same language. They did not even think in the same way. Communication between them had always been handled by the universal translation matrix on a vast system of algorithms and databases that could convert any known language into any other in real time. It was the invisible thread that held diplomacy, trade, and daily life together across 1,000 different worlds. It had also been a human creation. 40 years before the departure, a team of human linguists and computer scientists had rebuilt the translation system from the ground up. The old system, designed by the VORI centuries ago, had been slow, clumsy, and prone to errors. The humans replaced it with something elegant and precise. Self-learning network that grew smarter with every conversation it processed. They released it as open source software, free for anyone to use. The council adopted it without hesitation and without thanks, now without human engineers to maintain and update it. The system was degrading, and at first the errors were small, A misplaced word. Here an awkward phrase there, but language was a fragile thing and small. Errors in translation could lead to enormous misunderstandings. The first serious incident happened between the Torvani and the Pelith, two minor species who shared a disputed border region. A trade agreement was being negotiated, and the translation matrix rendered a Torvani word meaning shared access as a Pelith word meaning unconditional surrender. The Pelith delegation walked out of the talks in fury. Within a week, both species had mobilized their fleets. It took the council 3 months to calm the situation down. In the old days, a human mediator would have caught the error in minutes. But the council did not have human mediators anymore. It did not have human doctors or human engineers or human farmers or human soldiers. It did not have humans at all, and with each passing month, the full weight of that absence pressed down harder on a galaxy that had never bothered to notice how much it was being carried. The food crisis spread. All's reach had been a warning, but no one had paid attention. Now the same story played out on world after world. Human agricultural scientists had been working across the galaxy for decades, quietly optimizing food production for alien biospheres. They understood soil chemistry, weather patterns, crop genetics, and ecological balance in ways that other species did not. They had been doing this work for free as part of their endless effort to prove their value to the council. Without them, when harvest failed on 12 major agricultural worlds in a single growing season, famine spread across 3 sectors. The council tried to organize a relief effort, but the broken relay network made transportation slow and unreliable. Food rotted in cargo holds while people starved on the other side of a failed relay node, and through it all the Scythe kept coming. Scythe Confederacy had gone from raiding border colonies to launching full-scale invasions. They smelled blood. Council's military response was a disaster. Different species sent their own fleets but refused to coordinate with each other. The Dreth insisted on commanding every operation and then made tactical decisions based on brute force rather than strategy. The Valori contributed ships but held them in reserve and unwilling to risk their expensive vessels on what they considered someone else's problem. The Battle of Korath Nebula was the breaking point. The council assembled its largest fleet in a century, 12,000 warships from 40 different species to confront the Scythe Armada in the dense gas clouds of the Cori Nebula. On paper it was an overwhelming force. In reality it was a mess. There was no unified command structure. Fleets communicated on different frequencies. Attack plans were drawn up and then redrawn and then argued about until the Scythe struck. First, the battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, 8,000 council ships had been destroyed. The Scythe lost 400. It was not a defeat, it was a slaughter. The news hit the council like a physical blow. In the chamber on Nexus Primus, my delegates sat in stunned silence as the casualty reports came in. For the first time, many of them began to understand something that they had refused to see. For 200 years, human officers had led every successful joint military operation in living memory, not because humans were the strongest fighters or had the best ships, but because they had a gift that no other species seemed to possess. They could make different people work together. They could stand in a room full of species that distrusted each other and somehow, through patience and stubbornness and an almost irrational belief in cooperation, get them all pulling in the same direction. Without that gift, the Council's military was just a collection of separate armies wearing the same badge, and separate armies did not win wars. The Dreth Concordance, when humiliated by the defeat at Korath, tried a different approach. If they could not beat the Sith with ships, they would beat them with technology, specifically with human technology. A team of Dreth engineers was dispatched to one of the failing relay nodes with orders to reverse engineer its design and learn its secrets. They failed badly. The lead engineer, a Dreth named Vorash, was brilliant by his species standards. He had spent his career building warships and weapons, but the human relay node was nothing like a weapon. It was subtle and complex in ways that Dreth engineering did not account for. It did not overpower the laws of physics. It danced with them. It used principles that Vors had never encountered, and when he tried to apply Dreth methods to a human problem, the results were catastrophic. The Cascade failure knocked out every relay node in the Tessari sector. 14-star systems went completely dark. No communication, no travel, no contact with the outside galaxy for 3 months. An entire region of space was simply gone, cut off from everything as if it had never existed. When communication was finally restored through emergency backup channels, the Council learned that 2 of the 14 systems had experienced severe food shortages during the blackout. One colony had nearly collapsed into civil war. The death toll was in the tens of thousands. Counselor Ether, alone in her private chambers, sat in the dark and read. She had begun doing this weeks ago, going through the Council's records year by year, document by document, tracing the full history of humanity's time among the stars. What she found there kept her awake at night. It was not just medicine and engineering and military service, it was everything. Humans had been involved in everything. They had written educational curricula for species that could not afford their own schools. They had designed water purification systems for worlds with contaminated oceans. They had created art programs and music exchanges and cultural festivals that brought different species together. They had built parks and gardens on space stations so that people who lived in metal boxes between the stars could still see green things growing. They had done all of this while being treated as the lowest class of species in the Council. They had done it while being denied a vote. They had done it while being mocked and dismissed and ignored by the very people they were helping. And they had never, not once, demanded payment. Iris found a recording buried deep in the archives. It was from 3 years before the departure. Ambassador Vasquez was standing at the podium in the Council chamber, speaking in support of the 11th motion for human permanent membership. His voice was calm, his face was tired but composed. He did not shout or beg. He spoke the way a man speaks when he knows he will not be heard, but says the words anyway because they need to be said. We do not ask to be thanked. He said, we ask only to be respected. We have given freely of everything we have. Our knowledge, our labor, our blood. We have lost people defending worlds that are not our own. We have spent treasure building things that we will never use. We have done this because we believe in the idea of this Council. Do we believe that different species can come together and build something greater than any of them could build alone. He paused, his eyes moved across the chamber, and for a moment, just a moment, the tiredness showed through. If that belief is wrong, if this council cannot find room at its table for a species that has given everything and asked for almost nothing, then perhaps we have misunderstood our place here. The motion was defeated. 342 votes against, 1 vote in favor. Councillor Theek of the Marathi, alone. Iris closed the recording and sat, clear's throat in the silence of her room. She pressed her long silver fingers against her eyes and stayed very still for a long time. When she finally took her hands away, her face was the same mask it had always been, but her eyes were different. There was something new in them, something that looked very much like doubt. In the council chamber, a new faction was forming. They called themselves the Reconciliation Coalition, and they were led by younger delegates, people who had grown up watching humans work alongside their own species and who understood better than the old guard what had been lost. They were small in number but growing fast. Every failing relay node, every famine, every military defeat added new members to their ranks. Their leader was a young Pelith delegate named Curie, who stood before the council and said what many were thinking but few had the courage to speak aloud. We did not lose the humans, she said. We threw them away, and now we are drowning in the absence of everything they gave us. We can keep pretending that we are fine. We can keep telling ourselves that we do not need them, but the galaxy is dying piece by piece, and the only species that knew how to hold it together is gone. She was shouted down by the Dreth, but this time fewer voices joined the shouting. Far away beyond the edge of the galaxy, Sarah's sensors had picked up something new. She had been monitoring the rim from a safe distance as ordered, tracking the energy signatures from humanity's new home. The readings had been growing steadily for months, but now there was a spike. A massive one. She ran the numbers 3 times to be sure. The energy output she was detecting was consistent with not just a civilization, but an expanding one. The kind of expansion that required new colonies, new stations, new infrastructure built at a speed that should not have been possible, and humanity was not just surviving out there in the dark. They were building something extraordinary. Sarah recorded her findings and encrypted them in a priority message to Councillor Etheris. She attached a single line of personal commentary which was against protocol, but she no longer cared about protocol. The line read, "We should be afraid, not because they will come back for revenge, but because they might not come back at all." 3 years after the departure, the Galactic Council voted to do something it had never done in its entire history. It voted to apologize. The Reconciliation Coalition had grown from a handful of young delegates into a genuine political force. Kiari of the Pelith had proven to be a better organizer than anyone expected. She built alliances carefully, patiently, the way humans used to build things, and she did not demand or threaten. She simply kept pointing to the numbers, the death tolls, the failed harvests, the broken relay nodes, the scythe advance which had now swallowed 6 border systems with no sign of slowing down. The numbers did not lie. The resolution passed with a narrow majority. The Dreth voted against it, as they always did, but for the first time in 2 centuries they did not have enough votes to block the motion. Gorath stormed out of the chamber, his heavy footsteps cracking the stone floor. The resolution authorized a diplomatic envoy to travel beyond the galactic rim, locate humanity's new civilization, and deliver a formal apology along with an offer of full permanent membership on the council with senior voting rights. Councillor Withers voted in favor. She did not speak during the debate. Sunra simply raised her hand when the vote was called and then lowered it again. No one in the chamber missed the significance of this, the most powerful valor in the galaxy, the woman who had personally blocked human elevation for over a century, had just voted to bring them back. She offered no explanation. Her silver face was unreadable. Sarath was chosen to lead the envoy. She was given 5 ships and a crew drawn from a dozen different species. Her orders were simple: find the humans, deliver the apology, bring back an answer. The journey beyond the rim took 3 weeks. The space out there was different from anything Sarah had experienced. Council space was mapped and charted and busy with traffic. The space beyond the rim was vast and silent and dark, filled with dust clouds and dead stars and the kind of emptiness that made you feel very small. But the deeper they went, the less empty it became. The first sign was the beacons, small, elegant devices floating in the void, broadcasting simple navigational data on an open frequency. They were not hidden. They were not guarded. They were just there, like signposts on a road, guiding anyone who came this way toward their destination. The humans had left the door open. Then came the wormholes. Sarah had studied theoretical physics at the Viore Academy, and she knew that artificial wormhole generation was considered impossible by every major scientific body in the galaxy. The energy requirements alone were beyond anything the council could produce, and yet here they were, stable, perfectly formed tunnels in the fabric of space, connecting star systems that were light years apart. Her science officer ran the sensor readings 4 times and then sat back in his chair and stared at the screen in silence. The technology was not just advanced, it was revolutionary. It was the kind of leap that changed everything. They passed through the first wormhole and emerged in a star system that took Sarath's breath away. There were 7 planets, and every single one of them was alive. Not just colonized, but alive in the way that a garden is alive, tended and cared for, and growing. She could see cities on the surfaces, not the ugly industrial sprawls that covered most council worlds, but something different, something that blended with the landscape instead of crushing it. Towers that curved like trees, buildings covered in green growing things, rivers that wound through the streets like veins through a body, orbital stations hung in the space between the planets, enormous structures, some of them the size of small moons, glittering with lights and bustling with activity. Ships moved between them in organized streams, thousands of vessels going about their business with the easy confidence of a civilization that had found its footing. And this was just one system. Her sensors told her there were dozens more, all connected by the wormhole network, all thriving. The human border patrol found them before they had gone much further. 3 sleek ships dropped out of a wormhole ahead of them and took up formation around the envoy. They were fast and graceful with smooth lines and no visible weapons, though Sarah's suspected the weapons were there, just hidden. Humans had always been clever. About hiding things, a calm channel. Opened, a young woman's face appeared on screen, brown-skinned and dark-eyed, wearing a simple uniform with no medals or decorations. She smiled politely. "Welcome to the Terran continuity," she said. "You're the council envoy. We've been expecting you." Sarath blinked. "You knew we were coming. We've been monitoring council space since we left. We knew you'd send someone eventually. It just took longer than some of us expected." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a statement of fact. "Please follow us. Director Akefer is looking forward to meeting you." They were escorted through 3 more wormholes to a world that the humans called New Geneva. It was the capital of the Terran continuity, and it was the most beautiful planet Sarah had ever seen. She had visited many worlds in her career. She had walked the crystal spires of the Valori home world and sailed the floating cities of the Pelith archipelago, but New Geneva was something else entirely. It was not beautiful in the way that a monument is beautiful, grand and cold and meant to impress. It was beautiful the way a home is beautiful, warm, comfortable, loved. The city where they landed had wide streets lined with trees from 100 different worlds. Children played in parks where the grass was green and the sky was blue and the air smelled like flowers. There were schools and libraries and music halls and markets where people bought food that had been grown in soil, not manufactured in machines. There were old people sitting on benches watching the world go by, and when young people laughing and talking and living their lives without fear. It looked like what the council had always promised to be but never was, a place where different beings could live together in peace and plenty. Director Lena Akefer met them in a building that served as both a government center and a community hall. She was a tall woman, her 50s, with short gray hair and kind eyes and hands that looked like they had done real work. She shook Sarah's hand firmly and led her to a simple room with large windows that overlooked a garden. "I know why you're here," Akefer said, settling into a chair across from Sarath. "The council wants us to come back." Sarath nodded. She opened her diplomatic case and placed the formal documents on the table between them. The apology, the offer of full membership, the senior voting rights. And Akefer read them carefully. She took her time. When she was finished, she set the documents down and looked out the window for a long moment. "It's a good offer," she said. "Better than anything we were ever given before. I appreciate that." "Then you'll accept, Sarath?" And she was surprised to find that she wanted the answer to be yes, not for the council's sake, but because she had seen this world and these people, and she did not want the distance between them to remain. Akefer smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind of smile that carried weight. "I need to explain something to you," she said, "something that the council never understood about us, and I think you need to hear it if any of this is going to make sense." She leaned forward. "We didn't leave because of one thing. It wasn't just reach, though. That broke something in us that I'm not sure will ever heal. It was everything. It was 200 years of giving everything we had and being told it wasn't enough. It was watching our people die defending worlds that wouldn't even vote to help us. It was standing in that chamber year after year asking for a seat at the table and being told that our lives were too short, our emotions too strong, our nature too unstable." Her voice was steady. There was no anger in it. That was the thing that struck Sarah most. There should have been anger, any other species would have been furious, but Opper spoke the way a person speaks. About a wound that is healed but left a scar. We saw the writing on the wall. Decades before we left, we knew the council would never accept us as equals. And we realized that if we stayed, we would be slowly drained. Our knowledge, our labor, our blood, taken and used and never valued until one day there would be nothing left of us but a footnote in someone else's history. She paused, so we made a plan, Project Exodus. 30 years of preparation. We mapped the space beyond the rim. We developed new technology in secret. We built the infrastructure for a new home, and when the time came, we left, all of us, together, without saying a word. Saroth said softly, "What was there to say?" Akepper replied, "We had said everything. We had begged and argued and pleaded and presented evidence and made our case 1,000 times. No one listened, so we stopped talking and started building." She looked at Sarah with those kind, tired eyes. "We didn't leave because we hated you, and we left because we loved ourselves enough to stop letting you take us for granted." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah did not know what to say. In her entire career as an intelligence officer, she had never been at a loss for words, but sitting across from this woman in this room on this world that humans had built from nothing, in just 3 years she found that all of her training and all of her cleverness had nothing to offer. "I will bring your offer to our parliament," Akepper said. "They will decide. That's how we do things here, not with councils and hierarchies and class systems, with votes, real votes where everyone counts." "The same." Sarah nodded. She stood to leave, and then she hesitated. "May I walk around your city?" she asked. "While I wait for the answer." Akepper's face softened. "Of course, Anna, you're a guest here. Go wherever you like." And so Sarah walked. She walked through the streets of New Geneva and watched the humans live their lives. She saw a school where children of different human races sat together learning science and art and history. She saw a hospital where doctors treated patients with technology that made council medicine look primitive. She saw a workshop where engineers were building something that she could not identify, but that hummed with an energy that made the air feel alive. She walked until she came to a park at the edge of the city. It was quiet there and very green. Trees stood in long rows, their branches heavy with leaves, their trunks thick and strong. As she walked closer, she saw that each tree had a small metal plate at its base, and on each plate was a name. 40,000 names. She stood there for a long time reading them. A man walked past, middle-aged, with a child holding his hand. The child was eating something sweet and sticky and did not care about the trees, but the man looked at Sarah and seemed to understand what she was feeling. "Ours reach," he said quietly. 40,000 names, one tree for each person. "We lost." Sarah looked at the forest of the dead and felt something break open inside her chest. It was grief, but not her own. It was the grief of a species that had been hurt and had chosen not to hurt back, that had carried its dead in its heart and planted them in the soil of a new world so that something beautiful could grow from the loss. "We didn't forget," the man said. Then he walked on his child's hand in his and left Sarah alone among the trees. She stood there until the sun went down, and she did not say a word. The Terran Parliament debated for 19 days. Sarah waited on New Geneva while the humans decided the fate of the galaxy. She was given a small apartment near the government quarter with a window that looked out over the garden district. Every morning she woke to the sound of birds singing and trees that had been grown from seeds carried across the void. Every evening she watched the sun set behind the skyline of a city that should not have existed. She spent her days walking. She visited the university, where human scientists were working on things she could not begin to understand. She sat in cafes where people talked and laughed and argued about politics and sports and music. She went to the public library, a vast building filled with books, actual paper. Books went alongside the most advanced digital archive she had ever seen, and she listened to the debate. The parliament sessions were broadcast publicly. That had surprised her. On the council, decisions were made behind closed doors in private meetings. Deals were struck and favors traded. Here, every word was spoken in the open, and every citizen could watch and listen. The debate was fierce. Humans, it turned out, did not agree with each other any more easily than they agreed with aliens. The parliament was divided into factions that argued with passion and intelligence, and sometimes with raised voices that could be heard through the walls. There were those who wanted to go back. They spoke about duty and connection and the billions of innocent people in council space who were suffering because of the council's pride. A young representative from what had once been the colony of Aloras Reach stood up and said that she had lost her mother in the Scythian attack, and that her mother would have wanted them to help because helping was what humans did even when it hurt. There were those who wanted nothing to do with the council ever again. An older representative, a man who had served 30 years in human peacekeeping forces and had watched alien commanders take credit for his work, stood up and said that he had given enough. His voice was raw and honest and full of a pain that had been held in for a very long time. They called us lesser, he said. They called us unstable. They called us short-lived. They let our people die and sent us 3 sentences of condolence, Anton. And now they want us back because their lights are going out and their stomachs are empty and their enemies are at the gate. This is not reconciliation. This is desperation. And there were those who took a middle path. Director Akefer was among them. She did not speak during the early days of the debate. She sat and listened, her face thoughtful, her hands folded in her lap. When she finally rose to address the parliament, the chamber fell silent. I have spent 3 years building this world, she said. I have spent 3 years watching us become what we were always meant to be, a free people, an equal people, a people who do not need anyone's permission to exist. She paused and looked around the room. But I have also spent 3 years thinking about the galaxy we left behind, about the Myrai, who are dying of a plague we could cure, about the Pelith who are fighting a war they cannot win, about the millions of ordinary people on hundreds of worlds who never voted against us, who never mocked us, who never did anything except live their lives in a system that someone else built. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. We did not leave to punish anyone. We left to save ourselves. And we succeeded. But if we close our doors now, if we turn our backs on a galaxy that is suffering, then we become something we have never been. We become the kind of people who watch others die and send 3 sentences of condolence. The chamber was very still. I will not Become that, she said, and I do not believe any of you want to become that. Either. The vote was held the next morning. Sarah watched it on the broadcast from her apartment, her hands pressed together, her violet eyes fixed on the screen. The result was clear. Humanity would not return to the Galactic Council, but they would not close their doors either. The resolution that passed was something new, something that had never existed before in galactic politics. It was called the Framework of Equal Partnership, and it was the most human thing Sarah had ever seen. Under the framework, humanity would establish direct bilateral relationships with any species that wanted one: trade, scientific cooperation, medical aid, military alliance, all of it available but on equal terms, negotiated between equals. No hierarchy, no class system, no provisional status, no begging for a seat at a table that could be taken away by a vote. Any species that wanted to work with humanity was welcome. Would any species that did not was free to go its own way, and the council as an institution would have no authority over any of it. It was in its own quiet way. Revolution. Akefer delivered the terms to Sarah personally in the same simple room where they had first met. She placed the documents on the table and then added something else, a small crystal about the size of a human fist that glowed with a faint inner light. This is a data crystal, Akefer said. On it you will find the complete technical specifications for the FTL relay network, updated and improved. You will also find the formula for Veridine 7 and 43 other pharmaceutical compounds that we developed for alien biospheres in the agricultural optimization databases for every world where our scientists once worked. Sarah stared at the crystal. It was worth more than entire star systems. It was the collected knowledge of a species that had spent 2 centuries learning how to help everyone else, encoded in an object she could hold in one hand. We were never the ones who hoarded knowledge, Akefer said softly. That was you. Sarah took the crystal. Her hand was shaking and she did not try to hide it. She was not ashamed. Some things deserve to be felt. Thank you, she said. The words were not enough. She knew that, but they were all she had. The journey back to Council Space took 3 weeks. Sarah spent most of it alone in her quarters, reading the contents of the data crystal and trying to prepare herself for what came next. The council chamber was full. When she arrived, every delegate, every observer, every junior clerk was present. The gallery was packed. News of the envoy's return had spread across what remained of the functional communication network, and everyone wanted to hear the answer. Sarah stood at the podium, the same podium where Ambassador Vasquez had stood so many times before. She looked out at the hundreds of faces watching her, and she told them everything. She told them about the wormholes and the new worlds and the cities that grew like gardens. She told them about the university and the hospitals and the children playing in parks. She told them about the parliament and the debate and the vote. She told them that humanity was not coming back. The silence that followed was the deepest she had ever heard. It was not the silence of shock or anger. It was the silence of understanding, and the silence of a room full of people who had just been told a truth they already knew but had not been ready to hear. Then she told them about the framework of equal partnership. She told them about the data crystal. She held it up so that the light caught it, and it glowed in her hand like a small star. They are offering us everything they ever gave us and more, she said, but they will not give it to this council. They will give it to us species by species as equals. They will not submit to a body that spent 200 years treating them as less than what they are, she said. The crystal on the podium, this is more than we deserve, she said, and every person in this room knows it. Counselor Arthur stood, the chamber turned to look at her. The ancient Valori matriarch who had shaped galactic politics for centuries, what her silver face was still composed, still controlled, but something in the way she held herself was different. The rigidity was gone. She looked for the first time in anyone's memory like a person who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally decided to set it down. She walked to the podium. Saroth stepped aside. Iris looked out at the assembly, and when she spoke, her voice was not the voice of a politician. It was the voice of a woman who had finally run out of excuses. When they humans left, she said, I told this council that they would come back. I said they needed us more than we needed them. I was wrong. I was completely, catastrophically wrong. And the worst part is that I knew I was wrong. Even then I knew what they were worth. I knew what we were losing, but I was too proud to say it. Could my pride cost this galaxy more than I can ever repay? She reached into her robe and pulled out a data pad, the same data pad that Ambassador Vasquez had left on his desk 3.5 years ago. Sarah had retrieved it during her investigation and given it to Etheras in her report. The old counselor had kept it ever since. She held it up so the chamber could see the single word on its screen. Enough, she read aloud. That is what he wrote. One word. After 200 years of service, after decades of asking to be treated as equals, after watching 40,000 of his people die while this council nothing. He did not write a speech. He did not write a condemnation. He wrote one word and he left. She lowered the data pad. We drove away the best species this galaxy has ever known, not with war, not with cruelty, and with something worse, with indifference. We took everything they offered and gave them nothing in return, and when they finally stopped giving, we were surprised. Her voice cracked just slightly, just for a moment, but every person in the chamber heard it. We can accept their framework. We can begin to build something better, but let no one in this room pretend that we are being generous. We are being given a second chance by people who owe us nothing, and we should spend the rest of our lives being grateful for it. She sat down. Chamber erupted. The Dreth delegate Gorath stood up and shouted that this was surrender, that the council was humiliating itself before a lesser species, but his voice was lost in the noise. Other delegates were standing, not to argue but to agree. Reconciliation coalition surged forward. Motions were proposed and seconded and voted on in rapid succession. Old order was crumbling and something new was struggling to be born. It would take time, years probably. The damage was deep, and trust, once broken, does not mend quickly, but for the first time in a very long while there was hope. 6 months later, Saroth returned to New Geneva. She was no longer an intelligence officer. She was the Council's first official liaison to the Terran continuity, a position that had not existed before and that she had volunteered for without hesitation. First formal trade summit was being held in the government quarter, and delegates from 30 species had made the journey through human wormholes to attend. Atmosphere was cautious but warm. People were trying, that was what mattered. After the opening ceremony, Henra Sarath stepped outside for air. She found herself walking, as she always did, on this world toward the memorial park. The trees had grown since her first visit. They were taller now, their branches wider, their roots deeper in the soil. 40,000 trees for 40,000 names, growing strong in the sunlight of a new world. Director Akefer found her there. She walked up beside Sarath and stood quietly looking at the trees. The summit went well, Sarah said. It's a start, Akefer replied. They stood together in comfortable silence. Around them the park was alive with people. Delegates from different species walked the path between the trees, reading the names on the metal plates, some of them stopping to touch the bark as if they could feel something in the wood that words could not express. And there were children too, human children and alien children, playing together on the grass between the memorial trees. They chased each other and laughed and fell down and got up again, the way children do everywhere, on every world, in every corner of the galaxy. They did not know about the politics or the pain or the 200 years of silence. They only knew that the sun was warm and the grass was soft, and there were new friends to make. Akefer watched them for a long moment, then she looked at Sarah. We never wanted to be alone, she said. We just needed you to see us. Sarah looked at the children playing among the trees of the dead, at the alien delegates walking through a human garden, at the woman beside her who had led her people through the dark and into the light. She wanted to say something profound, something worthy of the moment, something that would capture everything she felt about what humans were and what they had done and what they had taught her about the meaning of strength. But some things do not need words. Some things are better left in silence, where they can grow like trees, with roots that go deep and branches that reach toward the sky. She nodded. And that was enough. Above them the stars shone down on a galaxy that was learning slowly and painfully, and for the first time to listen. The galaxy had spent centuries speaking over humanity. It took their silence to finally be heard.